Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Patrick Fruzzetti, Senior Research Analyst at the Rosenau Group at Hightower, to discuss how philanthropic initiatives and giving strategies can be impacted by election 2020. Patrick, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Nice to be here, Jill. Thanks for having me.
And let's run through a couple scenarios here. What are the risks and opportunities if Trump wins again?
Well, look, when I think about this election, we see that Biden's in the polls, but what we learned from 2016 is that anything can happen, right? But regardless of the election, certainly from a market perspective, I think the long-term trends are still intact. And with that being said, one of the more important things for, frankly, philanthropic activity is the health of the economy, the health of markets, because as people do better, they tend to be more philanthropic. So that is probably the most important factor, believe it or not.
And of course, how can philanthropic activity and tax treatment be impacted if we get a new administration there with a Biden win?
Sure. So the way I think about tax changes, et cetera, look, people are still going to contribute to organizations they care about at the end of the day, right? So that's going to continue. Where there can be potential impact is if you think about the change that's going on in corporate culture. And look, if tax rates go up with companies, perhaps that impacts some of the affiliations that they have with foundations. For example, I've read quite a bit about companies, tweaking certain things in their charitable organizations that they work with, that, again, everyone's looking at themselves these days and trying to determine who are the best organizations to affiliate themselves with. And I think that will change a little bit over time. But overall, from a dollars and cents perspective, I don't think there's going to be any specific tax changes where deductions are more, become more valuable to people from a charity standpoint. But overall, again, when people are thinking about giving to an organization, it really is dependent on the health of the economy and whether they have dollars, in their wallet at the end of the day. But the last thing I would say that I think is really important to anyone is that, organizations have really struggled during this pandemic. Because they don't have as many in-person events, right? It's much more difficult to raise money. There's the galas, the events are just not happening in person. And while, organizations have been creative in doing things virtually, it's been much more difficult environment. So that will continue for the time being. So long as things aren't completely reopened, I think those challenges will remain. And so long as, again, like I said, the economic activity hopefully stays somewhat stable and can improve, that will be a big factor going into 2021.
See, this is such an interesting topic to cover because, in theory, the focus of philanthropic activity should be on the organization supported, not so much the treatment of how donations are given. That's as a lay person sees it anyway.
Sure.
We hear about so much attention given to the donors, but are you seeing positive structural changes with how charitable resources are distributed and accounted for?
Well, I think that still, I haven't seen any major changes, no. I do think that, again, right now, organizations have had to run a very tight ship. So I do think a lot of organizations, whether it's, cutting staff, trying to cut down on office space, cut costs as much as they can to get through this pandemic. I haven't seen any major changes from a government perspective in terms of improving incentives on the organization side. But there's definitely room for improvement. I agree with you totally. I mean, they're always focused on the donor and not the donee. And I think at the end of the day, that could be improved. But I haven't seen anything on that front, whether it's the current administration or any future administration.
So what are some best practices investors should seek when committing to an organization, and how should they work with their financial advisors to be the most effective in advocacy as well as tax treatment?
Jill, I really appreciate that question. Me coming from an analyst background, I think one of the most important things to do is to do your work. When you're thinking of investing in a company, right, people tend to do some work on it, right? Or you'll hire an advisor to do the research for you. And I think one of the important things is people have to focus on what's important, number one, right? So there's these two phases that I typically look at is there's a discovery phase, right? Where it's, okay, what organization has the same, beliefs that I do? Are there commonalities, right? So you go out there and you try to, discover those organizations that do that, where you have sort of a common beliefs. So that's number one. And then there's this diligence phase, which is which organization is the best, which is going to really focus the dollars that I donate, that I'm planning to contribute. Because remember, once people make one contribution, it doesn't always stop there. And so as they continue to give money down the line, I think the most important thing is to make sure, the organization is filing things. There's a lot of stuff out there in a public domain. Do these organizations file, a 990 tax form? You can look at a lot of online portals, research sites that help you, learn more, looking into financial filings of these companies. And I know not everyone's trying to say, hey, are their accounting practices in good order? But you can actually see if there's something substantial there and how much money is going to that, is actually going to the cause at hand and not going towards just administration. I mean, there's always going to be some administrative costs, but I think that's certainly a good place to start is with some of these online portals like a GuideStar, for example.
All right, Patrick, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.